I sat there in my own home, where I'd rocked them to sleep, paid every bill, baked every birthday cake, and listened as my daughter folded her hands like a lawyer. This house, you, it's all too much. My son wouldn't meet my eyes. My granddaughter barely looked up from her phone. Then came the word, soft but sharp, burden. They didn't say it in anger. That's what made it worse. They said it like it was reasonable, expected. That night I poured my tea, fed the birds, and rewrote my will. Not out of spite, out of clarity. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The afternoon light fell in pale stripes across the hardwood, dust motes drifting lazily in the air as if time itself had slowed to watch. Megan was already seated on the edge of the couch, rigid, immaculate in her pressed slacks and pearl earrings, while Joel sat hunched near the fireplace, his elbows on his knees, eyes trained on the floorboards. Caitlin occupied the armchair, earbuds dangling, phone angled toward her lap like a tiny glowing shield. No one had called to say they were coming. No one had asked permission. Eleanor set her grocery bag on the entryway table, careful not to let the milk topple. "Well," she said softly, hanging her coat on the hook. "What's all this then?" Megan glanced up, voice clipped and managerial. "We need to have a serious conversation." Eleanor's pulse ticked once in her throat, then steadied. "Do we?" Megan gestured to Joel as if deputizing him to speak, but he only rubbed his palms together, the sound faint and dry. Caitlin didn't look up. A bubble of digital laughter leaked from her phone, followed by her muttered, "Sorry," group chat. Eleanor took in the scene, her own couch filled without invitation, her own silence stretched thin by their unspoken agenda. The smell of cinnamon still lingered from her morning oatmeal. Her teacup, half finished, sat on the side table beside yesterday's crossword. She felt herself become both host and stranger in the same breath. Megan cleared her throat again, sharper this time. "It's just not working anymore," she began, clasping her manicured hands. "This house. You. It's too much. We're worried about you, Mom." Eleanor tilted her head. "Too much what exactly?" "The maintenance," Megan said. "The bills, the isolation. You're 72. It's time to simplify." Joel's mouth twitched like he might add something, but he didn't. Caitlin finally looked up long enough to offer a thin smile. "Grandma, you've got equity. You should use it before—" She stopped, catching Megan's warning glance. "Before what?" Eleanor asked, voice light but cutting. "Before it becomes a problem," Megan said. "You shouldn't have to manage all this alone. We've been looking into options. Good ones. Modern condos. Assisted communities with shuttle service, game nights, everything you'd like." Eleanor moved slowly to her armchair, her favorite one by the window, the fabric worn soft where her hands always rested. She sat down, folded her hands, and looked at them all like specimens in a glass case. "I wasn't aware there was a vote," she said. Joel coughed. "It's not like that, Mom. We're just trying to help." "By deciding my life when I'm not in the room?" Silence swelled. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Outside, a chickadee landed on the snowy railing, pecking at a seed she'd left that morning. Megan crossed her legs, face pinched. "This isn't an attack. We just need you to be realistic. If something happened tomorrow, Joel and I would have to clean this place out. Handle everything. You have no idea what a burden that would be." There it was. The word. Burden. It hung in the air like the smell of burnt toast, impossible to ignore. Eleanor sipped from her cooling tea, her hand steady. "I see," she said quietly. "So, this is about your convenience." "Mom," Megan said with exaggerated patience, "it's about what's best for you." "No," Eleanor said, setting down her cup. It's about what's easiest for you. Caitlin rolled her eyes, muttering, "Here we go." Megan shot her a look, then turned back to her mother. "You can get angry if you want, but this is happening. We're not doing this forever. You need to make decisions while you still can." Eleanor let the words move through her, not around her. She looked at Joel, her once tender boy, now fidgeting like a man avoiding conflict. She looked at Caitlin, her only grandchild, her face half lit by the phone's blue glow, and she looked at Megan, her daughter, who spoke with the conviction of someone who believed being right was the same as being good. Eleanor stood, slow and deliberate. "If you've all said what you came to say, I'll see to my tea." "Mom," she raised a hand, stopping them. "No need to repeat yourselves. I heard you clearly." Eleanor turned toward the kitchen, the wood creaking softly under her slippers. Behind her, the whisper of movement, Megan gathering her purse, Joel's low sigh, Caitlin's faint tap of thumbs on glass, their voices tangled into something indistinct. As she poured hot water over a new bag of Earl Grey, steam rose like a veil between her and everything she'd just heard. Through it, she could still make out Megan's voice from the doorway. "We'll talk again next week, with options." Eleanor didn't look up. She stirred her tea once, slowly until the spoon touched porcelain. She didn't blink. She just smiled, small, secret, unreadable. The word burden kept unspooling in her head, soft at first, then louder, each repetition scraping against memory. She lay in bed and watched the faint glow of the street lamp slide across her ceiling, as if time itself were pacing the room. When dawn came, pale and cold, she was already up, hair brushed, kettle humming, the ritual movements of her morning steady and exact. By 10 o'clock, the knock came. Not one of them had texted ahead. Not a warning, not a, "Can we come by?" Just the same confident tap, tap, tap of people who believed the door would always open. Eleanor smoothed the front of her sweater and opened it anyway. Megan stood there first, clipboard in hand, lips pressed thin. Joel shuffled behind her, holding a cardboard box filled with envelopes and glossy pamphlets. Caitlin followed, thumbs moving over her phone as if composing an alibi. "Morning, Mom," Megan said brightly, stepping inside before being invited. "We brought some things to show you." Eleanor said nothing. She simply walked past them to the living room, reclaiming her chair. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and yesterday's confrontation. The space between them was thick with politeness, the kind that pinched. Megan began laying the pamphlets out across the coffee table like tarot cards. Maple Haven Senior Living, The Pines at Colchester, Carefree Retirement Village. Each brochure gleamed with artificial smiles, silver-haired couples on golf courses, women in pastel sweaters laughing over muffins. "We've narrowed it down to 3, Megan said, her tone brisk, efficient. "Each one offers independent living, healthcare support, transportation. You'd have your own unit, of course." Joel nodded mechanically, his gaze somewhere near the rug. "They've got really good reviews, Mom. People like it." Eleanor traced the rim of her teacup with one finger. "People?" she asked quietly. "People your age," Megan said, missing the sting in her own words. Caitlin leaned forward, scrolling through her phone. "Honestly, Grandma, some of these places are gorgeous. You could sell this place for a ton. You've got equity. Use it before it just sits here." Eleanor's eyes flicked to her granddaughter, then to Megan. "Equity," she repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what I'm made of now?" Megan inhaled, the sound tight. "Don't twist this. We're trying to make sure you're safe. This house is a liability. Big yard, old wiring, slippery steps. You're one fall away from a real crisis." Still, Eleanor didn't answer. She let the words collect in the air like condensation, dense, invisible, waiting to drip. Joel shifted uncomfortably. It's what's best, Mom. You'd be around people. You'd have help. We just want you to think about it. She nodded once, polite as always, and stood. I think better when the birds are fed, she said. Before any of them could stop her, Eleanor slipped through the kitchen door and out onto the porch. The cold Vermont air hit her face, sharp and clean, and she breathed it in like medicine. The snow in the yard was crusted with a thin sheen of ice. Her feeders hung heavy with sparrows, jostling for seed, indifferent to the family politics inside. She scattered more seed from a small tin, the metallic sound crisp in the stillness. One cardinal, bright as a drop of blood on snow, landed near her boots. It tilted its head as if to ask, "Why stay?" Inside, Megan's voice carried faintly through the window pane. "We'll talk again next week. With options." Eleanor smiled to herself. The word options felt like a leash disguised as kindness. She stayed outside until her fingers ached from the cold, until the sharp wind sliced through her sweater and her breath came out in steady white clouds. Each breath felt like an erasure, washing away the noise that had filled her house. When she finally stepped back inside, the living room was empty. The table was littered with pamphlets, neatly stacked by Megan before she'd left. A gesture of control, even in absence. Joel's empty coffee cup sat beside them, a faint ring staining her polished wood. Eleanor gathered every pamphlet in silence, folded them once, and dropped them into the fireplace. One by one they curled and blackened, the paper bending in on itself like a lie exposed. The flames reflected in the glass of the framed family photo on the mantel. Megan's smile frozen mid-command, Joel's mild compliance, Caitlin's half-attention. As the last pamphlet burned, Eleanor's reflection overlapped theirs, her face calm, almost serene. The house was silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock and the low hum of the radiator. A faint scent of burnt paper lingered in the air. Acrid, final. She carried her teacup into the study, the one room they never entered. The floor creaked softly beneath her slippers, and sunlight caught the edge of the old roll-top desk she'd kept since her nursing days. It had held everything that mattered: birth certificates, medical licenses, tax returns, and, somewhere deep in its drawers, the will she'd written 15 years ago when her husband was still alive. She found the folder under a stack of holiday cards. The cover sheet was crisp, still smelling faintly of the attorney's office, oak, toner, and thyme. She sat, pulled on her reading glasses, and spread the papers across the desk like a map of her own misplaced trust. Her husband's neat signature appeared first, then hers, elegant but trembling slightly. The ink faded to brown. Below, the names: Joel Gaines, executor; Megan Gaines, trustee. Eleanor's mouth tightened. She could almost hear Megan's tone now, command hidden inside concern, efficiency dressed as affection. And Joel, nodding along, hands clasped, muttering, "It's what's best." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "Best for who?" she whispered to the empty room. Her eyes lingered on a line about faithful management of estate assets. The phrase felt suddenly absurd. Faithful. She pictured Megan flipping through these same pages someday, looking for numbers instead of memories, calculating worth instead of love. Eleanor sat down, the will, and reached for her yellow legal pad, the one she used for grocery lists and Christmas cards. She tore off the first clean page. The pen felt heavier than it should have. At the top, she wrote, "New list." Underneath, slowly and carefully, "Executor, TBD trustee, TBD primary beneficiaries, TBD." She tapped the pen twice on the desk. The rhythm steadied her, almost like a heartbeat. She didn't know exactly what the new version would look like, but she knew one thing: their names would not appear again. From the window above her desk, she could see the bird feeder swaying gently in the cold breeze. The cardinal had returned, bold against the snow, hopping between the branches like it had somewhere to be. Eleanor smiled faintly at its audacity. A knock came from the back door. 3 short raps, familiar and unhurried. Nadine. Eleanor folded the will, slid it back into its folder, and tucked it beneath a stack of nursing journals before heading to the kitchen. Nadine Keller stood outside, bundled in a red scarf, cheeks flushed from the wind. In her hands was a ceramic pie dish covered with foil. "Don't even start," Nadine said, stepping inside before Eleanor could protest. "You've looked pale all week, so I baked. Again." Eleanor took the pie, the warmth seeping through the dish and into her palms. "Apple?" "Of course," Nadine said. "You think I'd waste butter on blueberry in winter?" They both laughed, the sound light but brief. Nadine started fussing with the kettle, scanning Eleanor's face in that way old friends do when they already know something's wrong. "What happened?" she asked quietly, not turning around. Eleanor hesitated. "Family visit," she said simply. "Unscheduled?" "As usual," Nadine nodded. "And?" "They brought paperwork," Eleanor said. "Ah." Nadine poured 2 mugs of tea and handed one over. "That tone tells me the paperwork wasn't about a family vacation." Eleanor smiled, but the corners didn't hold. "No, more like a relocation." Nadine snorted. "They think you're ready for shuffleboard and cafeteria soup?" "Over my dead body." Eleanor let out a soft laugh, but it dissolved quickly. She ran a hand over the tabletop, tracing the grain with her thumb. "It's funny," she murmured. "They think they're helping, but what they really want is permission, to feel better when they finally stop pretending to care." Nadine reached across the table, covering Eleanor's hand. "So don't give it to them." The clock on the wall ticked, filling the quiet between them. Eleanor looked toward the study door, where the edge of the yellow pad still peeked out beneath the light. She took a sip of tea, then set it down, decision settling in her chest like a stone finding its place in water. "I won't." Nadine squeezed her hand once, firm and certain. "Good. Because you deserve to finish your story your way." Eleanor's gaze drifted towards the frosted window, where faint tracks of birds crossed the snow like signatures. She did it quietly, like someone closing drawers after packing a suitcase. The first call went to the diner where she and Megan had their check-in lunches. Every second Thursday, same table near the window, same half-hearted smiles. She pressed the receiver to her ear and said, "This is Eleanor Gaines. I won't need that standing reservation anymore." The hostess hesitated, but Eleanor had already hung up. The next call was shorter. A voicemail to Megan. "You're busy, I know. Let's skip this week," she said, tone polite but final. She didn't bother giving a reason. Excuses were currency in their family, and Eleanor was done trading. The day was gray but steady. The sky over Burlington hung low, like a sheet about to tear. Eleanor dressed in her wool coat, tucked the yellow pad into her purse, and went to the attic. The air smelled of cedar and old paper. Boxes stacked high, labeled in her husband's handwriting. Baby clothes. Toys. Megan, 1979. She opened one, the cardboard soft from years of rest. Inside, she found the small wooden cradle her husband had built for Megan. The varnish worn, one leg slightly uneven. A soft quilt lay folded inside, its stitching neat but faded. Eleanor brushed her hand across the wood, remembering the nights she'd rocked Megan to sleep, humming through exhaustion. The memory ached, but it didn't hurt like it used to. It was more like pressing on a bruise long healed. By noon, she was driving toward the shelter on Route 7, the cradle secured in the back seat with an old blanket. The radio murmured classical strings, quiet enough to let her thoughts breathe. The shelter's sign came into view. New Start Family Services. A volunteer greeted her at the curb. "Donation?" he asked, his voice muffled by the cold. "Yes," Eleanor said. "This belonged to my daughter once. It's time it belongs to someone else. He smiled, carrying the cradle gently inside. She watched until it disappeared through the door. Something inside her eased, as if she'd returned a kindness to the world that her own family had misplaced. She drove next to Main Street, parking beside the law office with the brass plaque, Walter Reed, Esque. The building was old but dignified, the kind of place where secrets were filed as neatly as tax returns. Walter had been her attorney for 20 years, sharp eyes, gray hair like storm clouds, voice low and deliberate. He looked up from his desk when she entered. "Eleanor," he said, standing to shake her hand. "You look resolved." "Let's call it clear," she said, setting her purse on the chair. They sat across from each other, the room lined with oak shelves and quiet authority. Walter adjusted his glasses and pulled up her file on his screen. "Your last will is still as we left it. Joel as executor, Megan as trustee, equal shares to both children. You've always been organized, I'll give you that." Eleanor folded her gloves neatly on the desk. "That's why I'm here. I'd like to make some changes." He studied her face for a moment, searching. "Big ones? Complete ones?" Walter leaned back, fingers steepled. "May I ask why?" "Because I've been mistaken for someone I'm not," she said softly, "and I'd rather not leave them with that illusion." He blinked, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's start with the basics." She slid the yellow legal pad across the desk, the word TBD written 3 times in block letters. Walter smiled faintly at her precision, then turned serious again. "You're sure about this?" Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. "They're sure about who they think I am," she said. "I might as well make it official." He let out a low whistle, then began typing, the rhythmic click of keys filling the quiet. The smell of polished wood and printer ink mixed with the faint hum of the radiator. Outside, snow began to fall, soft flakes catching in the window's reflection. Eleanor watched them drift and vanish against the glass. For the first time in months, she didn't feel invisible. She felt deliberate. Each keystroke on Walter's keyboard sounded like a door closing somewhere behind her. When they finished, Walter printed a preliminary draft and slid it across the desk. "We'll need to notarize after you finalize beneficiaries," he said. "No rush, but once you sign this, there's no going back." Eleanor nodded. "That's the point." Walter gave a small, approving smile. "You always did know your mind." Eleanor stood, fastening her coat. "It took them long enough to remind me." Outside, the snow had thickened, the streets quieter now, coated in white. Eleanor paused beside her car, breathing in the cold until it bit at her lungs. She felt stripped clean, emptied of noise, of guilt, of explanation. The morning sun glazed the snowdrifts in gold, the world outside still and untouched. She made her tea in silence, savoring the quiet before the next irreversible act. The yellow legal pad sat on her kitchen table, a new page ready. Across the top, she wrote in her steady cursive, "Final Will and Testament, revised." The ink glided sure and dark. By 9:30, she was parked again in front of Walter's office. The snowplows had passed, leaving neat banks on either side of Main Street. She carried her folder in one hand, the pad tucked inside like a secret. The brass plaque beside the door gleamed despite the cold. Walter Reed, Esquire. Inside, the heat was dry and heavy with the smell of paper and ink. Walter looked up from his desk, surprised but not displeased. "You're early," he said. "I didn't see a reason to wait," she replied, unbuttoning her coat. He gestured for her to sit. "Then let's get to it." Eleanor slid her papers across the desk. "I've decided." Walter adjusted his glasses and read the notes. She'd written in neat columns, beneficiaries, designations, and a few names crossed out with deliberate strokes. As his eyes moved down the page, his brows lifted. "Not one of them?" he asked finally, glancing at her over the rim of his glasses. "Not one," she said. Her voice was calm, almost tender. "I've been their safety net for 40 years. Maybe it's time someone else benefited from my good habits." Walter leaned back, exhaling. "You're donating everything?" "Not everything," she said, her eyes softening. "Some things are going where they'll matter." She took a breath. "The house, savings, investments, they go to the Burlington Community Hospice. The food pantry on Elm Street gets 50,000, and Nadine." Her voice warmed slightly. "Nadine gets the rest. The cars, the contents, what's left of my husband's pension." Walter blinked, then let out a low whistle. "That's significant. She's earned it." He studied her, tapping his pen lightly against the desk. "You understand this will cause fallout." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Fallout implies there's something left to destroy." Walter chuckled under his breath. "You've got a poet's sense of justice." "I was a nurse for 40 years, she said. "Justice looks a lot like preparation." He began typing, his fingers deliberate on the keys, the rhythm slow and exact. Eleanor watched the printer hum to life, spitting out her clean, rewritten will, each page crisp, legal, and final. She signed where he pointed, her name looping smooth and certain across the lines. When the last page was notarized, Walter stood and extended his hand. "Filed and official by 2 o'clock, he said. "If you change your mind before then—" "I won't," she interrupted. He nodded once, the respect in his eyes quiet but unmistakable. "You always did have a way of keeping people guessing." "Not anymore," she said, sliding on her gloves. "This time, I'm the only one who needs to know the ending." Outside, the afternoon light was thin and pale. Eleanor stopped at the corner cafe, the one with the chipped blue mugs and fogged windows. The smell of roasted beans and cinnamon clung to her coat as she settled by the window. Her reflection shimmered faintly against the glass, superimposed over the winter street beyond. A woman who looked neither old nor young, just certain. She sipped her coffee slowly, watching the birds in the parking lot fight over crumbs. One small sparrow darted between larger starlings, relentless, determined. She couldn't help but smile. Her phone buzzed against the tabletop. The sound sliced through the quiet. Megan. For a moment, Eleanor simply watched the name light up the screen, as if it belonged to a stranger. The text preview read, "Call me. We need to talk." She didn't move to answer. Not yet. Instead, she set the phone face down, lifted her mug, and took another sip. The bitter warmth settled deep in her chest. Outside, the snow began again. Light, unhurried, covering everything in silence. Then the phone buzzed again. Longer this time, persistent. Eleanor's pulse didn't quicken, it slowed. She could almost hear Megan's voice already. Sharp, demanding, framed as concern. She reached out, thumb hovering above the screen, not to reply, but to delete. The cafe door opened, a bell chiming faintly as cold air rushed in. Somewhere behind her, a waitress asked if she wanted a refill. Eleanor didn't answer. The first voicemail arrived at 6:12 a.m. Megan's voice, tight and clipped, filled the kitchen as Eleanor spread butter across her toast. "Mom, please. Let's be civil about this. There's no need for all this drama." The word drama made Eleanor smile. That tone had always been Megan's favorite tool. Control disguised as reason. By the second voicemail at 8:47, Megan's patience had thinned. "I don't know what Walter's thinking, but you can't just erase family, Mom. That's not how it works." The third came just after noon. "If you're trying to punish us, congratulations. You've made your point. But this isn't you." Eleanor pressed delete after each one, her thumb steady. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a call, a notification from social media. Caitlin had posted a photo, the view of Eleanor's snow-covered backyard. The caption read, "Memories." The eye-roll emoji hung like a dagger wrapped in teenage indifference. The comments were worse. Friends chiming in with heart emojis and, "Miss this place," as if Eleanor were already gone. Eleanor chuckled softly and powered off her phone. The kitchen clock ticked beside the slow hiss of the radiator. She'd never realized how many conversations lived in the air until she chose not to answer any of them. By mid-morning, the house smelled of yeast and patience. Dough rose in 2 ceramic bowls by the window, domed and soft beneath dish towels. Eleanor worked the dough with steady hands, pressing and folding, the rhythm soothing and solid. She thought of her mother's hands doing the same 50 years ago, the way they'd kneaded through grief and war and every small betrayal life delivered. The first loaf went into the oven. The second she shaped carefully and wrapped in parchment. It wasn't for family. It was for the food pantry. Outside, the snow had lightened, the sky a soft pewter gray. She drove slowly, the bread cooling beside her on the passenger seat. The Burlington Community Food Bank sat behind the Methodist Church, its entrance modest but busy. Inside, volunteers moved briskly among shelves of canned goods and paper bags. A man in a worn fleece vest smiled as she approached the counter. "Donation drop-off?" Eleanor nodded and held out the parcel. "Fresh bread, just baked." He grinned. "We don't get many like that. You want a name for the ledger?" She shook her head. "No, need. Just make sure someone hungry gets it warm." He hesitated, then smiled again, understanding without pressing. "We will." As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of a young mother at the far end of the room, holding a toddler bundled in pink. The woman looked exhausted but grateful, the kind of tired Eleanor had seen too often in the hospital corridors. Their eyes met briefly, a silent exchange that said everything words couldn't. Back home, the scent of baked bread lingered like a memory she didn't need to keep. The phone blinked on the counter. 4 missed calls now. 1 from Joel. His message was short. "She means well, Mom. She's stressed. Don't take it personally." Eleanor smiled at that. Joel had always been the peacemaker, but peace was a language that only worked when everyone spoke it. She wiped flour from her hands, then deleted his message too. The kettle whistled softly. She poured the tea and carried 2 mugs to the kitchen table, where Nadine was already sitting, coat half off, expression bright. "Caught you mid-bakery again," Nadine teased, breaking off a piece of bread. "I swear you're running your own carb revolution." Eleanor laughed, the sound light and clean. "Keeps my hands busy." "And your mind?" Nadine asked, eyes glinting. Eleanor stirred her tea. "That too." Nadine took a slow sip, studying her friend. "You know, you look different. Not younger, just lighter. Like you set something heavy down." "Maybe I did." "Good," Nadine said. "Because you're more alive now than I've seen you in years." Eleanor smiled. The compliment didn't inflate her. It steadied her, like a truth she'd been waiting for someone to confirm. Outside, the snow had started again, light and fine, soft enough to blur the sharp edges of the world. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind only long friendship allows. Then, from the counter, Eleanor's phone vibrated once more. Persistent, insistent. Megan again. Eleanor didn't look at it. She reached instead for another slice of bread, still warm from the oven, broke it in half, and handed a piece to Nadine. The invitation had come the week before. A group text from Megan, full of forced cheer and bullet points. "Dinner at 6. Just family. Don't make it awkward." Attached was a photo of a restaurant menu, upscale and colorless. Eleanor had stared at it for a moment before typing a single word: unavailable. Then she'd put her phone face down and never looked back. Now, as the digital clock on her stove blinked 5:52, she stood in her kitchen stirring a pot of beef stew, the smell of thyme and slow-cooked onions filling the house. The snow outside reflected the porch light, throwing a soft shimmer across the counters. Nadine sat at the table, flipping through an old Vermont Life magazine, her glasses sliding halfway down her nose. "You sure you don't want to go?" Nadine asked, though the question was more habit than doubt. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I've attended enough performances for one lifetime." Nadine grinned. "Amen to that." The stew bubbled gently, thick and rich. Eleanor ladled it into two heavy bowls, the kind that kept warmth long after the food was gone. They ate slowly, spoon clinking against ceramic, each bite grounding. No toasts, no speeches, no clock watching, just the hum of the radiator and the steady fall of snow outside. "I always forget how quiet it is here," Nadine said softly. "That's the point," Eleanor replied. Across town, she knew the restaurant would be full of chatter and low lighting, Megan holding court with the same perfection that had driven every family event. Timed, planned, efficient. Joel would laugh too loudly at something meant to smooth things over. Caitlin would scroll beneath the table, hiding her boredom in her phone's glow. Eleanor didn't need to be there to know the script. Her phone buzzed once on the counter, Joel's name. She wiped her hands, glanced at the screen, and sighed. "Joel. They're mad. Just show up. Please, it'll make things easier." She typed, erased, and finally replied, "Easier for who?" Then she set the phone back down, screen dimming to black. "Trouble?" Nadine asked. Eleanor shook her head. "Just habit knocking." They finished their stew, wiped the bowls clean with buttered bread. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows lightly. It was the kind of sound Eleanor once found lonely. Tonight, it felt like protection. After dinner, they moved to the living room. The fire crackled low in the hearth, the kind of heat that eased into the bones rather than smothered them. Nadine pulled a blanket over her lap and sighed. "You ever think about how peace gets mistaken for sadness?" "All the time," Eleanor said, "mostly by people who can't stand still long enough to feel either." Nadine chuckled, eyes closing briefly. "Remind me never to argue with you." Eleanor smiled, but her gaze drifted toward the darkened window. Somewhere out there, Megan was likely raising a glass, laughing too loudly, posting photos that would make their lives look whole. That was the family's favorite sport, appearance management. At 8:03, Eleanor's phone buzzed again. She didn't reach for it, but the sound carried in the quiet. Nadine arched an eyebrow. "She's not giving up, huh?" Eleanor shrugged. "She's not used to not being heard." Eventually, curiosity won. Eleanor picked up the phone. The notification wasn't a text. It was a social media post. Megan's name at the top, followed by a quote framed on a floral background. "Family means forgiving even when it's undeserved." Beneath it, a flurry of comments from coworkers and friends. "So true." "Preach." "Hugs, girl." Nadine leaned over and snorted. "Passive-aggressive. Party of one." Eleanor set the phone down with a small laugh. "It's her love language." She crossed the room, unplugged the Wi-Fi router from the wall, and flipped off the modem switch. The hum stopped instantly. Silence reclaimed its rightful place. For a long while, neither woman spoke. The fire cracked, a log collapsing inward, sparks rising like tiny rebellions. Eleanor looked into the flames, the light flickering across her face. "You know," she said, voice quiet but sure, "I think they're finally seeing me the way I wanted. Absent, but not gone." Nadine tilted her head. "That's colder than the snow outside." Eleanor smiled, slow and deliberate. "No, it's cleaner." Eleanor slit the envelope open with her butter knife, careful not to tear the contents. The handwriting was neat, looping. someone who still cared about penmanship. The stationery bore the hospice logo in soft gray. She unfolded it, the paper trembling faintly between her fingers. Dear Mrs. Gaines, on behalf of our entire team, I wanted to thank you for your generous gift. Your contribution has already helped us cover the cost of heating and supplies for 2 patients this month. One of them, a retired teacher, asked me to tell you something. Whoever sent this must understand peace. With sincere gratitude, Carol Dempsey, RN, Burlington Community Hospice. Eleanor read it twice, maybe 3 times. The words didn't bring pride, they brought quiet, the kind of quiet that filled the gaps left by noise. She set the letter on the table beside her tea and stared out the kitchen window. The snow had melted into wet ribbons along the fence, but the air still smelled of winter. Sharp, mineral, alive. On the counter lay a manila folder marked Final Arrangements. Inside, prepaid funeral paperwork, notarized 2 years ago after a bad flu season had reminded her how fragile the body could be. She flipped through the pages. Service details, cremation preferences, her request for no eulogies. If they didn't understand me in life, she'd told Walter at the time, they won't get a second chance at interpretation. She signed the last confirmation page with fresh ink and slid the folder into the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet, beneath the mortgage receipts and insurance policies. It was strange how much peace could fit inside one locked drawer. The phone on the counter buzzed again. Joel, this time. You okay? You're scaring Meg. Eleanor let the message sit for a moment, watching the 3 blinking dots of his follow-up vanish. She typed slowly, deliberately. I'm the calmest I've ever been. No punctuation, just truth. She hit send, turned the phone face down, and opened the window a crack. The cold air swept in, stirring the papers on her desk, brushing against her wrists like approval. By late afternoon, the light thinned to amber. A car crunched up the driveway. Nadine's old Subaru, the sound of her arrival now as familiar as breath. Eleanor met her at the door. Apple cider? Nadine announced, holding up a thermos in one hand and a stack of crisp envelopes in the other. And before you ask, yes, it's hot. And no, I didn't spike it. Though God knows you deserve it. Eleanor smiled, ushering her inside. I was just finishing something. Legal or emotional? A little of both. They settled at the kitchen table. The cider steamed between them, cinnamon curling into the air. Nadine noticed the stationery and pens spread out before Eleanor, the kind of old-fashioned set with creamy envelopes and heavy paper. Ah, Nadine said knowingly. The legacy project continues. Eleanor dipped her pen into the inkwell, testing the flow on a scrap sheet. These aren't legacy letters, she said quietly. They're instructions. Nadine leaned back, watching. For them? For after, Eleanor said. The room fell into soft rhythm, the scratch of pen, the sigh of the radiator, the ticking clock measuring out small eternities. Eleanor wrote steadily, each line neat and unsentimental. To Megan. You were right, it was too much. Just not in the way you thought. To Joel. Don't apologize for peace you didn't make. To Caitlin. Visit the world, not my house. To Walter. Thank you for being the last man to keep my secrets. And finally, one for Nadine. For laughter, for tea, for the space to be myself. By the time she finished, dusk had gathered at the edges of the kitchen. The envelopes lay in a tidy row, addressed in her graceful hand. Nadine slid one of them closer, tracing her name. You know, she said softly, most people write these too late. I don't plan to be most people, Eleanor said. She pulled out a box, wooden, small, polished smooth by time, and began placing the envelopes inside. When she reached the last one, she sealed it carefully, pressing her thumb to the flap until the adhesive held. Then, in her careful script, she wrote across the top, to be opened after my funeral. Nadine reached for her cider, her eyes glinting in the low light. You're not going anywhere soon, you know. I know. Eleanor smiled, folding the letterbox shut. That's why I'm doing it now, while it's still a choice. Outside, the wind rose, tugging at the bare trees, making them creak like old memories. Eleanor stood by the window, the box in her hands, and watched as a single bird cut across the dusk, its wings sharp against the fading gold. Her kitchen smelled faintly of apples and wood polish. On the counter, the wooden box of sealed letters waited, neat as prayer books. She touched the lid once, not to second guess, only to confirm it still existed. Then she slipped it into her tote beside her folder marked Estate Revision, Gaines, E., and her thermos of cocoa. The drive to Walter's office was slow. Sunlight caught on the frost-slick pavement, turning the streets into narrow ribbons of glare. Eleanor drove carefully, hands steady at 10 and 2, the radio murmuring old jazz through the static. By the time she reached Main Street, her resolve had settled into something calm, almost ceremonial. Walter looked up from behind his oak desk when she entered. "You don't waste time," he said with a grin, gesturing toward the chair she'd already made her own. "Time's a luxury," Eleanor replied, setting her bag down. He adjusted his tie, scanning the documents she slid across the desk. "This is your final draft, then?" She nodded. "All of it." Walter flipped through each page, reading with the reverence of someone who'd spent a lifetime in other people's endings. He paused at one section, his brows lifting slightly. "You're removing Megan as your medical proxy." "Yes." "And Joel as executor." "Yes." "Replacing them with—" He trailed off, reading aloud. "Nadine Keller and—" He glanced at her. "A hospice social worker?" Eleanor sipped her cocoa. "Her name's Clara Jennings. She's young but capable. Kind, without pity. She took care of my neighbor's husband last spring." Walter leaned back, letting out a long breath. "You understand this means your children have no legal control over anything. No decisions, no rights, no access." "That's exactly the point." He nodded slowly, then smiled in that way lawyers do when something both surprises and impresses them. "You've thought this through." "Every detail," Eleanor said. "I'm done giving people permission to misunderstand me." Walter began typing. The printer hummed, spitting out fresh, official pages that smelled of ink and resolve. When he slid them toward her, Eleanor signed each with steady grace. Her name looked deliberate, like a signature that had waited decades to mean something. He notarized the packet, stamped it twice, then stacked the copies into a tidy pile. "You now have 3 sets," he said, sliding each one into a labeled envelope. "One for your safe, one for Nadine. One stays here." Eleanor tucked her copies neatly into her bag. "I'll lock mine away this afternoon." Walter hesitated, then asked gently, "Do you ever wonder if they'll understand someday?" She smiled. "No, but I hope they'll learn." He didn't press. They exchanged a handshake that felt like the close of a story neither needed to retell. Outside, the afternoon had softened into pale light. Eleanor walked to her car, the cold biting at her cheeks, her heart oddly buoyant. She wasn't angry anymore. Not at Megan's control or Joel's quiet loyalty or Caitlin's distance. The absence of anger was something cleaner than forgiveness. It was freedom. By the time she reached home, the air had the crisp stillness that comes just before snow. She set her bag on the porch table and filled her mug with the last of her cocoa, now lukewarm, but comforting. The winter hills beyond her yard rolled pale and endless. The trees stood bare and beautiful, unashamed of what they'd lost. She sat down in her porch chair, pulling a blanket over her knees. Her breath rose in white clouds that dissolved before reaching the railing. On her lap, a small folder labeled Emergency. Updated 2025, sat ready for her safe. Inside were copies of her will, proxy, and all the choices that now belonged to no one but her. Nadine's voice echoed in her memory. "You're more alive now than I've seen you in years." Eleanor smiled faintly. She was right. There was a peace in finalization, in the slow weight of things put to rest. Her phone buzzed against the armrest. She nearly ignored it, another reflex she was learning to master. But the screen lit up with Megan's name. A text this time. "We need to talk. Before it's too late." Eleanor stared at it for a long moment, her thumb hovering. Too late for what? To change her mind? To rewrite her story again in their handwriting? The mug of cocoa steamed softly in her hand. Across the field, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Slow, deliberate, certain. She set the phone face down, letting the vibration die against the wood. The hills turned white again, erasing everything but the quiet. Through the frosted window, she saw Megan's SUV glinting in the weak winter light. Caitlin stood beside her, arms folded, face half buried in a scarf. A bouquet of supermarket flowers dangled from Megan's hand, plastic sleeve fogged from her breath. Eleanor didn't rush. She rinsed her cup, dried it carefully, then opened the door just wide enough to let in the smell of cold air and artificial roses. "Mom," Megan said brightly, voice straining toward cheer. "We were in the neighborhood." "Were you?" Eleanor said evenly, leaning against the frame. Caitlin shifted, exhaling an impatient puff of steam. "We're just checking in," Megan continued, holding out the bouquet like a peace treaty she didn't believe in. "It's been a tense few weeks." Eleanor eyed the flowers, carnations, dyed pink at the edges, wilting slightly where the stems met the rubber band. "They're lovely," she said, taking them only long enough to set them on the porch rail. "Now they won't die twice." Megan blinked, caught between offense and diplomacy. "You don't have to be like this, Mom. We're trying." "To do what?" Eleanor asked. "Undo what's done? Rewrite what I wrote?" "That's not fair." "Fairness," Eleanor said quietly, "is not what you were asking for at the meeting." The memory hung between them like a third person on the porch, the living room confrontation, the word burden still echoing faintly. Megan glanced back toward her car, then tried again, softer. "Let's not keep punishing each other. I just want to talk." "I think you've said enough." From across the yard, Nadine's laugh floated through the crisp air. She was standing by her mailbox in her red parka, one hand on her hip, watching like it was neighborhood theater. When Eleanor caught her eye, Nadine raised her mug in salute. Caitlin noticed. "Is that the nosy neighbor?" she muttered. "The loyal friend," Eleanor corrected. "There's a difference." Caitlin rolled her eyes, stepping forward. "Grandma, this is getting ridiculous. You don't have to be petty." Eleanor's gaze sharpened, though her tone stayed calm. "And you," she said, "don't have to be in my will." The silence that followed was almost artful. Megan's jaw tightened. Caitlin's mouth fell open. Even the wind seemed to pause. "Wow," Caitlin said finally, her voice breaking with a half-laugh. "You really are serious about this, aren't you?" Eleanor folded her arms. Seriousness is what happens when people stop listening to polite requests. Megan's control began to fray. "Do you hear yourself? This isn't who you are. You're being free?" Eleanor supplied. "Cruel." Eleanor tilted her head. "I was kind for 72 years, Megan. Maybe I'm overdue for balance." Caitlin tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Let's go. She's made up her mind." But Megan stayed, her expression hardening into something that looked more like disbelief than anger. "I don't understand how you can just cut off your own family." Eleanor's voice softened, almost tender. "Because, darling, you already did. I'm just signing the paperwork." She stepped back into the doorway and gently closed the screen door between them. The latch clicked. Quiet. Final. Through the mesh, Megan's face blurred, her words muffled into something small. Caitlin crossed her arms tighter, eyes flicking to the flowers on the railing, then down to the porch floor. Nadine's voice called from across the yard, bright as daylight. "Everything all right over there, Ellie?" "Perfectly," Eleanor said without turning. Megan took a sharp breath. "You're going to regret this." Eleanor met her daughter's gaze through the screen. "I already did. Once." She closed the main door slowly, feeling the click of the deadbolt travel through her bones. Inside, the warmth felt cleaner. She stood for a moment, listening, tires crunching, voices fading, the engine revving too loud, too fast. Then silence returned, wrapping itself around the house like insulation. From the window, she could see Nadine across the yard, still standing in her coat, grinning like someone who just watched a perfect ending to a play. She raised her mug again. Eleanor lifted hers in return. "Two boundaries," she said quietly. The wind shifted, carrying away the last trace of their voices. On the porch railing, the flowers trembled in the cold, petals beginning to crisp at the edges. Eleanor sat at her dining table, a photo album spread open before her. Not the family one that lived on the living room shelf, the one trotted out for guests or holidays, filled with obligatory smiles. This album was hers, new, leather-bound and unshared. The pages gleamed black and empty, waiting. She pulled an old box from the sideboard, the kind that had traveled through 3 houses and 4 decades. Inside were photographs without context, Polaroids curling at the edges, prints from drugstore envelopes, even a few negatives she'd never developed. She began sorting them with a slow, deliberate rhythm. She placed one of her and her late husband near the beginning. Summer at Lake Champlain. Wind in his hair, his hand steady on the small of her back. Their laughter had been caught midair, the kind that came before bills, before children, before worry. Then came a photo of her in her nurse's uniform, hair tucked neat under her cap, eyes alert but soft. She slipped it in beside the lake picture, anchoring her story in work and love, the 2 constants that had never asked for gratitude. A photo of Megan as a child surfaced next, pigtails, missing tooth, holding a lemonade stand sign half her height. Eleanor stared at it a moment, thumb resting on the corner. There was affection there, yes, but the nostalgia no longer bit. She turned the page and placed it face down under another photo of Vermont snow. Joel's image followed, 7 years old, covered in grass stains, smiling at something just out of frame. She held it longer. Then, carefully, she set it aside. "This one's mine," she murmured, slipping a sticky note across the page she'd skipped. Her pen glided in tidy blue ink. They had everything. Still wanted more. The sentence looked both cruel and kind. Honest, at least. She pressed the note down until the glue caught. The back door opened with a familiar squeak. "You'd think you'd oil that hinge by now," Nadine called, stepping inside with her usual energy and a Polaroid camera slung around her neck. "I like the sound," Eleanor said. "Reminds me who's coming and going." Nadine grinned. "You're in a productive mood." "Organized, not nostalgic," Eleanor corrected. "There's a difference." Nadine looked over her shoulder at the album, nodding approvingly. "Oh, I see what you're doing. You're editing the story." "Not editing," Eleanor said. "Choosing which parts to remember?" Without asking, Nadine lifted her camera and snapped a picture. The flash burst bright against the morning light. Eleanor blinked, half amused. "What was that for?" "For proof," Nadine said, shaking the film until the image began to bloom. "Of what freedom looks like at 72. Eleanor laughed, softly. "You're sentimental for someone who pretends she isn't. Someone's got to document your rebellion." The Polaroid developed into something imperfect, Eleanor seated at the table, light spilling across her hands. Photo albums open like a map to somewhere she'd already been. Nadine slipped the photo under the plastic sleeve beside the lake picture. "There," she said. "Now it's complete." Eleanor ran a finger over the new photo. Her face looked unguarded, almost serene. For once, the picture matched the truth. The phone rang then, its old-fashioned trill slicing through the quiet. Eleanor reached for it, expecting silence or confrontation. Instead, Walter's familiar baritone greeted her. "All documents filed," he said. "Clean and sealed. You're officially untouchable." Eleanor smiled faintly. Music to my ears. "You did it exactly right, Eleanor," he added. "Every I dotted, every T crossed. It's airtight." "That's what I was aiming for." Walter hesitated. "So how do you feel?" Eleanor looked out the window where snowmelt dripped steadily from the porch roof. The world was brighter now, raw but clear. "I'm finally free," she said. There was a pause, then a soft laugh from Walter. "Then I'll consider that my best case of the year." When the call ended, Eleanor returned to the table, turning the Polaroid one last time under the light. The edges gleamed, still drying. She closed the album carefully, the sound of the cover meeting the table soft but certain. From outside, she heard Nadine humming off-key as she crossed the yard. The faint scent of thawing earth drifted in through the cracked window. Through the window, she saw Caitlin's silver car idling at the base of the drive. For a long moment, it didn't move. Then the door opened, and her granddaughter stepped out, wrapped in a thin jacket, hair pulled into a messy knot that had given up halfway through the drive. The girl, no, the woman, Eleanor corrected herself, stood there, clutching something in her hands. A phone, probably. A shield. Eleanor didn't go to meet her. She simply opened the front door and waited. The air carried the faint tang of thawing earth and leftover snow, a smell that always reminded her of endings trying to pass for beginnings. Caitlin climbed the porch steps, her face blotchy and wet. "Hi, Grandma." Eleanor nodded once. "Hi, Caitlin." The words sat between them like stones on a frozen pond. Caitlin started, then stopped. "Can I sit?" Eleanor motioned toward the porch swing. It creaked under Caitlin's weight, the old chains sighing in rhythm. Eleanor sat across from her, folding her hands in her lap. The air was still enough to hear the faint tick of the wind chime by the door. "I didn't mean it," Caitlin said finally, voice trembling. "All that stuff I said, the post, the jokes. I was just following Mom's lead." Eleanor looked at her, not unkindly. The girl's mascara had run, streaking faint gray beneath her eyes. There was sincerity there, but also youth, the kind that still believed apologies could undo patterns. "Your mother leads with fear," Eleanor said softly, "and you followed with convenience. There's a difference." Caitlin flinched. "You don't understand what it's like with her. She gets so worked up. It's easier just to agree." "Easier," Eleanor echoed. "Yes, that's the word your family likes best." Caitlin wiped her nose on her sleeve. "I didn't mean for things to go this far." "They always go as far as you let them," Eleanor said, her tone quiet, measured. The porch creaked under their shifting weight. Beyond the railing, a pair of chickadees darted between the trees, small flashes of motion in an otherwise still afternoon. Eleanor watched them for a long moment, letting the silence stretch just enough to make the girl squirm. Finally, Caitlin's voice broke the pause. "I don't want you to hate me." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "I don't hate you." "Then why won't you talk to me?" "I am talking to you." "But not like before." Eleanor smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and release. "Because before, I thought you were listening." Caitlin's lip trembled. "I just want things to go back to normal." There's no normal left to go back to, Eleanor said. That's the beauty of finally telling the truth. It burns the bridge behind you. Caitlin looked down, twisting her phone in her hands. So that's it? You're just done? Eleanor stood, slow and deliberate. No, Caitlin. I'm just finished explaining. The younger woman's eyes filled again. You're colder than I thought. Eleanor looked out over the yard, where patches of grass had begun to peek through the melting snow. No, she said. I'm clearer than you hoped. Caitlin rose abruptly, the swing shuddering behind her. For a second, Eleanor thought she might say something angry, or brave, or both. But she didn't. She just turned, walked down the steps, and crossed the gravel with the same hesitating steps she'd arrived with. The car door slammed, the engine flared, and the silver sedan disappeared down the hill. Eleanor stayed on the porch until the sound faded completely. Then she went back inside, the house greeting her with its usual stillness. On the kitchen table lay her box of letters, the ones she'd sealed for after. She opened it, pulled out the one marked, "To be opened after my funeral." Caitlin, and unsealed the flap with a careful finger. The letter inside was brief, perhaps too gentle. She read it once, sighed, and took out her pen. Beneath her original line, "Visit the world, not my house," she added a single sentence. And remember, apologies are choices too. She folded it neatly, pressed the flap closed again, and wrote her granddaughter's name a second time. Firm, legible, deliberate. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of spring. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn echoed and then vanished, leaving only the rhythm of her own heartbeat in the quiet room. The call from Walter came just after 9 in the morning. His tone was formal but touched with something warmer, a quiet satisfaction. "It's done," he said. "All final updates are filed and recorded. As of this morning, every previous connection, trustee, proxy, executor, has been legally severed." Eleanor let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "So that's it," she said. "That's it," Walter confirmed. "You've built a fortress, Eleanor, a very elegant one." "Not a fortress," she corrected softly. "Just a home with a locked door." Walter chuckled. "Semantics aside, congratulations. You're the most unshakable client I've ever had." When she hung up, she stood for a moment by the kitchen window, watching sunlight roll across the thawing fields. Her coffee had gone cold, but the warmth inside her chest lingered. Later that day, she met Walter downtown to sign the final deed amendment, her last act in this long unraveling. The document was clean and official. Transfer of property title, co-ownership, Eleanor Gaines and Nadine Keller. Walter looked over the rim of his glasses as she signed. "She knows, right?" "She'll find out tonight," Eleanor said, her tone light. "I'm not robbing her of a good surprise." When she left the office, she didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove to Elm Street, where the Burlington Community Food Pantry sat tucked between the church and the old post office. The volunteers waved her inside, smiling with the familiarity of someone who sees kindness often but still doesn't take it for granted. A young man in a green apron met her by the back storage room. "Mrs. Gaines," he said, "we wanted to show you something." He led her to a newly installed freezer, sturdy, gleaming stainless steel, humming softly. A blue ribbon stretched across the front. On it, a small plaque read, "In honor of Eleanor Gaines." Because quiet generosity feeds loudly. Eleanor ran her fingers across the engraving. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. The volunteer smiled. "We wanted to. The new freezer means we can take twice as many donations. You made that happen." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and stood there for a moment, letting the hum of the machine fill the space where old noise used to live. When she returned home, Nadine was waiting in the yard, pruning early rose bushes with her sleeves rolled up. I got a message from Walter, Nadine called, straightening. You sneak. Eleanor smiled. You would have argued if I told you first. Damn right I would have, Nadine said, grinning through her mock protest. You didn't have to put me on the deed. I was fine just being the nosy neighbor. Eleanor walked over, taking in the smell of damp soil and the faint sweetness of new growth. You've been more than that, Nadine. You're the only person who's shown up for reasons that weren't about me dying or downsizing. Nadine's eyes softened. You're something else. You know that? Something else, Eleanor echoed. That's one way to put it. By late afternoon, the sky had settled into a pale blue wash. Eleanor pulled on her boots and took her usual walk along the edge of her land. The air carried that early spring mix of mud and new life. The hills glowed faintly green beneath melting patches of snow. Each step felt deliberate, as if she were tracing the border of everything she'd reclaimed. She paused near the maple grove where her husband used to hang bird feeders. The chains were rusted now, the hooks empty, but the wind still made them sway, faint metal notes against the breeze. For the first time, the sound didn't ache. It just was. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She almost didn't check it. Peace was fragile, and interruption had a way of clawing through it. But curiosity won. A social media notification. Megan. The post was public, loud and performative, a long caption paired with a filtered photo of the two of them from some long ago Mother's Day. What kind of mother turns on her family? Some wounds never heal. The comments below came fast. Coworkers offering sympathy, distant cousins chiming in, strangers clapping for a narrative they didn't know. Eleanor scrolled once, then stopped. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. For a long moment she considered doing nothing at all, but then she thought of the freezer with her name on it. The quiet dignity of clean paperwork. The roses Nadine was trimming next door. She typed one word in the comment box, hit send, and locked the screen. Boundaries. The sky darkened at the edges as she slipped the phone back into her pocket. The breeze lifted, cool and sharp, carrying the scent of thawing earth across her land. She stood there, listening to the world turn soft around her, the hum of the house behind her steady and certain. The idea came to her one morning while clipping an article from the Burlington Free Press about community volunteers. The piece was full of smiling faces and perfect platitudes, gratitude without grit. She thought of the hospice letter on her fridge, of the food pantry plaque with her name, of all the quiet work that never made print because it wasn't photogenic enough to trend. She sat at her kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling beside her, and began to write. Not as Eleanor Gaines, the retired nurse or the widow with family troubles, but as Eleanor Whitfield, the woman she had been before marriage, before motherhood had renamed her into someone else's story. Her pen moved quickly, deliberate as a heartbeat. Care isn't something you inherit. It's something you decide to keep giving, even when no one's watching. We build legacies not through bloodlines, but through the kindness we leave behind when we stop asking for permission to be kind. She signed it simply. E. Whitfield, Burlington. It felt less like authorship, and more like returning a piece of herself she'd lent out for too long. 2 days later, she folded the letter neatly and dropped it into the blue mailbox outside the grocery store, her cart rattling beside her with oranges, flour, and a single bouquet of tulips. She didn't tell Nadine, or Walter, or anyone at all. If it was printed, it would be its own quiet rebellion. The following Sunday, there it was. Halfway down the opinion page, nestled between a column on local zoning laws and an essay about spring planting. On quiet work and lasting care, the byline read. Not her married name, not her family's legacy, just E. Whitfield. She read it once, smiling at how anonymous it felt. For once she was untraceable, but unmistakably herself. By midweek the small-town echo had already begun. At the grocery store, a young cashier recognized her. I think I read something you wrote, she said shyly. That piece about kindness? My mom cut it out and stuck it on our fridge. Eleanor smiled, setting her loaf of bread on the counter. It's good when words find a home. Later, near the produce aisle, the town librarian waved her over. Lovely writing, Miss Whitfield, she said knowingly, eyes twinkling. You can change your name, but your punctuation gives you away. Eleanor laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. By the time she reached the parking lot, 3 more people had stopped her just to say thank you. Their gratitude wasn't grand, but it was real. Quiet nods, softened tones, human acknowledgement unfiltered by performance. Driving home, she passed the long stretch of road leading out toward the hills, and that's when she saw it. Megan's car, parked across from her driveway. For a second, Eleanor thought she might step out. She didn't. The engine idled, brake lights glowing like hesitation itself. Eleanor parked beside her mailbox and waited. Through the windshield, she could see her daughter's outline, shoulders stiff, head bowed toward the steering wheel. There was no confrontation this time, no words shouted through glass, no phone vibrating with expectation. After a long moment, Megan's car rolled forward and turned back toward town. The silence that followed was almost kind. When Eleanor went inside, she found a small envelope on her welcome mat. No name, just her address printed in block letters. The postmark was smudged. She opened it carefully, half expecting another estate inquiry or local flyer. Inside was a plain white card. On the front, no picture, no sentiment. Just Joel's handwriting, spare and neat. Hope you're well. Take care. No return address. No signature beyond the familiar scrawl of his first name. Eleanor traced the ink once, the faint indentation in the paper. Then she folded the card shut and slid it into the junk drawer beside the spare batteries and old receipts. She didn't need to throw it away. She just didn't need to keep it. That evening, she walked out to the porch with a glass of cider. The hills were turning gold beneath the sinking sun, the air warm enough to taste rain. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed faintly, a sound of life going on without permission. Eleanor looked out at the stretch of road where Megan's car had idled earlier and whispered, almost to herself, "Everyone has a name they have to take back eventually." Inside, the newspaper still sat on her kitchen table, folded to her essay. Her maiden name glowed faintly in the lamplight, untouched by the world's fingerprints. Eleanor sat in her armchair, wrapped in the same quilt she'd sewn decades ago from scraps of old uniforms and curtains. A book lay open in her lap, its pages glowing amber in the firelight. 2 cats slept at her feet, rescues, both stubborn, both loyal in their indifference. The rhythm of their breathing filled the room with the soft assurance of continuity. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. No longer winter, not yet spring. The sound wasn't lonely anymore. It was simply the sound of the world existing without expectation. She reached for her reading glasses and spotted an envelope tucked under the edge of the newspaper on the side table. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful, neat, almost ceremonial. She opened it, the paper rustling in the silence. Dear Mrs. Gaines, I wanted you to know that your second gift arrived yesterday. The timing couldn't have been better. The freezer you helped us buy is full, and now the kids' meal program can keep running through summer. Every week people say your name here, though I suspect you'd prefer we didn't. Thank you again for giving quietly but deeply. With gratitude, Tom, Burlington Food Pantry. Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile that began in the chest and worked its way outward. She placed the letter beside her, next to the earlier one from the hospice. She'd never asked for her name to be printed anywhere, but seeing it spoken of this way, by people who meant it, felt better than any obituary ever could. From the kitchen came the familiar clatter of Nadine moving about, humming a tune that wandered between folk song and jazz. The smell of warm cider drifted in, sweetened with cloves. Still reading that same book? Nadine called. Eleanor chuckled. Still pretending to. I keep rereading the same page. You always do that when you're content. Do I? Uh-huh, Nadine said, her voice growing nearer. She appeared in the doorway, a mug in each hand, cheeks flushed from the stove. You get this little half-smile like you're saving the ending for later. Eleanor accepted her cup, the steam curling against her face. Maybe I am. Nadine took the seat across from her, sinking into the couch with a satisfied sigh. You know, she said, gesturing with her mug. For someone who was supposed to slow down, you've built a whole second act. Retirement looks better when you stop trying to please the audience, Eleanor said. Nadine laughed, loud and honest. You're gonna outlive us all. Eleanor smiled, eyes glinting in the firelight. I plan to. They drank in companionable silence. The fire cracked, a soft pop like punctuation to a finished sentence. The clock on the mantel ticked slow and forgiving. Somewhere outside, a fox barked once and then fell quiet again. When Nadine rose to rinse their mugs, Eleanor leaned back, the quilt shifting against her shoulders. Her gaze swept over the room. The framed photos she'd chosen to keep, the sturdy oak bookshelves, the clean stack of firewood by the hearth. Every object here had been chosen, not inherited. It was a house built on decision, not obligation. She thought briefly of her children, of the distance that now sat between them like a fence no one was brave enough to climb. She didn't hate them. She didn't even resent them anymore. What she felt now was simpler, a sense of scale restored. They occupied a smaller space in her world as they were always meant to. The cat stirred, stretching languidly before curling back into sleep. Eleanor reached down to scratch behind one ear, smiling. I suppose we're all finally where we belong, she murmured. In the kitchen, Nadine sang under her breath as she washed the mugs, off-key, unhurried. The domestic sounds folded neatly into the quiet, not disrupting it, but completing it. Eleanor closed her book and placed it gently on the side table. She didn't need to finish the chapter tonight. Some stories, she thought, were better savored than concluded. She rose slowly, joints protesting but steady, and crossed to the window. The moon had risen above the hills, pale and soft, the same color as the steam from her tea. The fields below shimmered faintly with dew. Her reflection stared back. Silver hair, clear eyes, no trace of hesitation. She looked like someone who had finally stepped into her own outline. Behind her, the fire whispered low, the sound like old promises burning themselves clean. Eleanor turned off the lamp, letting the moonlight do the work. Her home glowed gently, every corner exactly as she wanted it. Quiet, bright, completely hers. She exhaled, long and even, feeling her chest expand with something weightless. No more meetings, no more negotiations, just decisions. Hers. She brushed her hand over the worn wood of the mantel, where the faint reflection of the fire shimmered like a heartbeat. Then, with the smallest smile, she whispered into the stillness,